Okay, hi everyone, good evening and welcome to our first online session for phase 2 for the React Native Developers Bootcamp organized by Techshanti and partners. I'm glad to have all of us here present to be able to learn and expand our skills on how to build web and mobile applications. And as we had communicated earlier, today we're going to have our first session, and it's going to be part of it is going to be on revision for hooks, and the other part is going to be how to make API calls where you can get data, you can post data, you can update data from a particular remote source. And today we are honored to have one of our finest in the community. He's one person whom we started this bootcamp together, I think 2019. He was a trainer at that time, and I was a co-trainer. And last year too, he was an online trainer where he put his skills and assisted the community to grow. So without much ado, I think he has a very big profile. He's worked for a lot of companies and he has built a lot of experience. If I'm not mistaken, over 9 years of experience in building front end for business, local and international. So let's, I don't know if we'll say, put our emojis together and welcome Engineer Daniel Carlson to assist us in this session for React Native hooks and API calls. Carlson, you have the floor. Carlson, we cannot hear you if you're talking.
Can you hear me now?
It's quite low. Okay, I think it's better. Can everyone get him? Yeah, okay, thumbs up shows is good.
Okay, so today talking about hooks, React.
Yeah, Carlson, the mic is very low and it's breaking. Maybe it's your headphone.
Can you get me now?
Yes, very better now. Go turn off the video.
Sir.
Turn off your video. Turn off your video.
Okay.
Yes, Carlson, can go ahead.
Okay. I'm sure everybody can get me now. Okay. Okay. So just we'll be talking about hooks and then API calls. In terms of hooks, I'm guessing you already know something about hooks. I'm just going to explain a little bit and then we'll just dive into code, if that's okay. I'm sure everybody can get me now. I saw somebody sending thumbs down. Okay. So hooks in React were introduced React 16, I think. React Native. And hooks allow functional components have access to states and other features that are available to React. And so with the introduction of hooks, it kind of made class components a bit obsolete. They are not deleted, but they are no longer needed because they're a bit bloated. And some of the reasons why you would use hooks is because hooks generally make your code cleaner. They are much smaller and they are much easier to test. So when you get to the point where you need to start writing tests for your code, you realize that writing tests for functional components are much easier than writing tests for class components. And that's one of the reasons why you would stick to functional components, because with functional components, you can actually maintain them much more easily. And using functional components, we can use hooks to access lifecycle methods that were initially only available to class methods. I hope that explanation is clear. If anybody doesn't understand that, you can just ask. Okay, if there is no question or nobody is asking, we will proceed on to writing some code. So I have set up very simple, very basic React Native application where I'm going to be walking you through the usage of hooks. Let me see if I can share my screen. VS Code, where is VS Code? Do I have VS Code? Can you see my screen? Okay. I see it's still loading for some people. For some people, they can't see my screen. Okay. So let me just download VS Code so we can use that. So this is a simple React Native application I created. Yeah, I've not started writing anything. I created this using Expo. So this is the application we see here. Can everybody see the simulator? So I'm running this on an iPhone, the iPhone simulator. Can you please mute your mic? Is the font size okay now? Okay. So for the sake of I'm just going to clean this up. Okay. So we can see that I'm not going to change much on this. I'll just leave most of this. Let me also take out, let me see. Okay, let me just leave this like this. So this is our simple application.
Carlson?
Yeah.
I think you could just remove everything so that we don't have a lot of anything on the screen that's not very relatable to this, like the headers and all of those. Could just start with an empty view or the parallax scroll, so that we avoid so much complexity on the screen.
Can everybody see what we have? Okay. So the first hook we'll be talking about is the useState hook. The first hook we'll be talking about is the useState hook, and we use this hook to keep track of the state of a component. So this is, for example, a component we are in, and if we want to keep track of the state, like if we are creating variables, we want to create the state of those variables in this component, we'll use the useState hook. And how we use the useState hook is we import useState. As I'm sure we all know, React Native is some sort of a subset, I'll put as I can put it, of React. So some of the hooks we'll be creating, we'll be importing them from the React library rather than from the React Native library, and this still works fine. So like I mentioned, the first hook we'll be talking about is the useState hook. And how we use the useState hook is when we create a variable, we are going to use the useState hook to keep track of that variable. So in this case, let's say we wanted to keep track of a color. Let's say if we had some text here which said so in our app, we see that we have my favorite color is blue. Let's say we wanted to keep track of that particular state, in this case, the color, and we wanted to be able to change it based on a particular variable. We would use the useState hook. And how we use the useState hook is we would have something like this. And in order to use the color from our state, we would have to replace this with so we see that we have replaced we have updated the color to use our state when the app reloads. And in this case, we are saying that the initial color should be blue. So if we wanted to change this color, we could say change this to red. And you see that my favorite color is now red. So useState can take an argument, and that argument serves as the initial value of the variable you are declaring. So in this case, let's remove this. In this case, we are saying that we want a variable and we want this component to keep track of that variable, and we want it to have an initial value of red. And that's why we have this initial value here. Now, say you were doing something else, or you wanted to click a button, and on button click, you change this color. You would have to update the state, because remember we said we are keeping track of that state. So when changes are made to that state, the component has to know that changes have been made to that state. And you cannot just do color equal to blue, because React is not going to want this to happen. React is immutable, so they're going to refuse this. So state is immutable. You cannot just change state like that. You need to use what we call an updater. And the useState function also returns an updater function that we can use to update our state. So if we hover over useState in your VS Code, you'll see that it takes an initial state as an argument, and it has a return type of a React dispatch, React set state action. So forget about most of the things you're seeing. They just focus on the set state action. So that's what we are going to be using to update our state. And in the case of React Native, we'll need to make use of that updater function. So you can call this function anything. But the norm, the idiomatic way of using hooks is that we always call the updater function we always name the updater function by starting with set and then the name of the variable. So in this case, we will say set color. So now this is the updater function for this variable that we have here called color. And if we wanted to change it, let's say we have a button. I think we'll have to style our button a little bit. So because we are not then change this, use text, same to our button text. Let's keep this button as see, and then I'll just this delete center. Okay, so we have our button here, and we want this button to change our text whenever we click on it. So you see that when you click on this button, it changes the text to my favorite color is pink. This is because we are using the updater function from state, and then we are using that to update our color variable to whatever argument we pass here. Remember we said when you hover over this, you see that color is a string because the interpreter is able to read that this argument that we passed here is a string. And if you hover over set state, you see again that set state takes an initial state. So you can always have an initial state here as an empty string. And in this case, it's going to complain here a little bit because the initial state here is undefined. But if we, so you could do something like this, and that will fix that error. If you are using something like TypeScript, like we are in this case, you could also define the type of the variable that you want to manage its state. You could define its type like this. So this is example on useState. And now useState must not hold just strings. You can have many things that useState can hold. Let's say we are talking about a car, for example. You could have the brand of a car. Let's see, we are keeping track. We are almost done. Let's say we want the model of that car. Let's see, 1964 model. Let's use the Polo. In this case, we are keeping track of a red car. So in our text here, we can say my car is A, and pass the brand, and its model is, and we pass the model, it is so we will now see that my car is a Mustang and its model is this, it is red in color and all of this. So you see that we can keep track of all these attributes of a car using use states. And then we have so if you remember, I said the idiomatic way of naming the updater functions is using set before the name of the variable. But as always, you can name this, you can have any name here, but if you follow this style, other developers who are coming to your code will easily understand that that is what you are trying to achieve. You can also have objects. You can also have objects. Let's say we have a car and we have a set car, and then we'll have, so you can have multiple use states. So in this case, we have one object that we are passing to use state, and we are saying that, okay, we are keeping track of a whole object, and that object is a car object, and the car object has as attributes brand, model, year, and color. If you hover over this, you see that it shows that the car is an object with attributes brand, model, year, and color, as opposed to when we hover over the model, for example, it just tells us that it's a string. Now, in the case of updating objects, if we did something like set car here, and we said, say for example, wanted to update the brand, and let's say we did something like brand, and we changed it to Mercedes, for example, you see that this will, why is it complaining? Why is it crying? You see that it is the editor is already complaining, but if your editor for some reason did not complain, this will override whatever you had in this state, and so now your car will no longer have a model, year, and color. So whenever you're updating an object in a state, you have to be very careful to ensure that the rest of the objects are also copied along, and you can do that using the spread operator. So in this case, we'll do something like this. You can do previous state. So in this case, you see that we have taken the previous state, and then we are saying that we'll keep track of all of that, the previous state, and we'll change only the color variable. So here we are using the spread operator from JavaScript to get the rest of the variables, and then we are updating just the color value. So this is how you update an object in a state. Any questions on use states? So we are going to talk a bit extensively about use state and use effect. The rest of them, I'm just going to quickly walk you through them, but we are not going to talk about them too much because those are the ones that you will eventually find when you actually need them. But for most of the components you'll be creating, you're going to definitely need to use state and use effect. So are there any questions on use states? If there are no questions, we will just go on to talking about use effects. So use effect is a hook which allows you to perform. See somebody put their hand up. Yeah, you can just go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. I just joined. I don't understand what use state is.
So useState is used to keep track of a component's state. So this component, we might have variables that we want to keep track of during the life of this component. We can use useState to keep track of those component states. So that's what useState is. In simple terms. And we have said here that we can create a variable and useState, the useState function from React comes with, it gives us the variable and an updater function. So take note that these names here are given by you. You can name this anything. You could even have on age, my age, and you say 12, right? So this is perfectly fine. But the reason why I said we follow this style or this format where we have set and then the name of the variable to name the updater function is so that other developers working on your code will easily understand what some of the functions in your code are. So normal in that case, you have to have this as set age. So so anything you can give a variable in JavaScript, you can give to useState. So I've shown you how to use strings, and I've also shown you how to use objects. And I said in the case of objects, when you're updating an object, you don't just access one of the attributes from this object that you want to update. You have to keep track of all the attributes of this object. And how you do that in React Native using hooks and useState is you have to keep track of the previous state. So using the previous state, you see that if you hover over this, you see that it gives you all the attributes that were present before your update. So in this case, we are maintaining everything in this object, but we are changing the color to blue. I hope that answers your question. So the next hook we'll be talking about, did somebody put their hand up? Go ahead if you put your hand up. I'm not.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Sir, please, I would like to know the function of safe area view because I'm using it, but it's not able to display anything.
It's not.
I'm using the safe area view element, but it's not display anything on the screen.
Safe area view is not supposed to display anything. It just makes sure that it just ensures that everything you're writing falls within the safe space so it doesn't overlap. Because if I change this to view, you see that my content overlaps. It goes under the phone header bar there. So safe area view prevents that from happening. So what if you introduce a new attribute to the object with the previous state? No, you cannot introduce new attributes to the object because we are keeping track of this state. We already have a state that we are keeping track of. So you can access and read this state, but changing it to something else entirely is something that you don't need to do. So use effects. So use effect hook allows you to perform side effects in your component. So some side effects that you can have in your components are fetching data, updating the DOM, doing timers and stuff like that. Let me see. Let me make this a bit cleaner. Okay. So some examples of side effects, like I mentioned, fetching data, updating the DOM, or changing some component on your screen based on other actions happening, are what we generally refer to as side effects. So use effect accepts, it takes two arguments. So it takes the function and it takes the dependencies. So the second argument in this case, which is the dependency, is optional. So you must not have a dependency, but you must always have a function. So an example of a use effect, I'll create a simple use effect. So this is our function. So we haven't updated use effect. Yeah. So this is our function. So here we have an arrow function. Excuse me, please. Sorry about that. So like I was saying, the first use effect takes two arguments. The first is a function, and the second is a dependency. The second argument is optional. The first argument is compulsory. So every time you try to use a use effect hook, you must have a function at the very least. So in our case, let's just do a simple timer. So in this case, we want to keep track of accounts. So we'll come up here. So you must not create all of this at the top of the file, but it is advised that you do that so that it is cleaner. So anybody going through your code can easily see all of the attributes that you have. So in this case, we want to keep track of a time of accounts. So we'll start it at 0. So you see that here we are using a combination of useState and useEffect. So here we are saying set count, and we'll update the count to 1. And then we can let's just so we see that it is so we want to mimic a clock, for example. So we see that our count is so we see that we have a counter here. So this is a side effect that we are keeping track of, or we are performing in this component. And to do that, we have had to use the use effect hook. And so in our case, we pass a function, and that function uses set timeout to increment a count every 1 second. This is the reality of using use effects. And take note that use effect runs on every render, and how it runs depends on the dependencies that you provide. In our case, we have provided no dependency. So in this case, on every render, it's going to run, which is why every time it runs, it updates our count variable that we have here. And because we are keeping track of this variable using useState, we are able to achieve our timer. I hope use effect is clear. So now we can also control when useEffect runs. So right now, as it is like this, it runs on every render. So every time something causes our component to be re-rendered, the useEffect hook will be run. If we only want it to run once, we'll add an empty dependency here. So in this case, let's add that empty this there, and then we'll reload our app. So you see that it has run just once. And the reason why without this, it kept running is because when we ran this the first time, it updated a state variable. And every time you update a state variable, it causes the component to be re-rendered. And so each time we re-rendered this component, we're updating the state value, which led to it re-rendering each time. And then we had our counter. Now that we have added an empty dependency here, so in this case, this is what we call an empty dependency. The dependencies have to be in the form of an array. In this case, it only runs once, and that's on the initial render. So even if we update or change state variables in this case, it's not going to cause our counter to increment because we have just the empty dependency array. So yeah, useEffect is acting like component did mount from class cycle methods. Are there any questions? So I've said useEffect is used to perform side effects. And useEffect is of this form. So the function takes two arguments. Remember, in JavaScript, functions are first-class citizens, so they can be passed as arguments to other functions. So useEffect in this case receives a function as its first argument and an array as its second argument. The second argument is optional. You must not have it there, but the first argument must be there. So every time you're creating a useEffect, you should always have a function you are passing to it. So I did an example here showing you how we can use useEffect to implement a timer. And I said if you don't have this second argument here, you see that our timer is going to keep counting. So if I reload our app, it's going to keep counting. But in the case where, and this is because on every render of this application, of this component, we update a state variable. And when you update a state variable, it causes the component to render. Now we want this effect to only run on initial render. So the very first time you run this component, that's the only time we want useEffect to run. In that case, we can have an empty dependency array. So in this case, it's only going to run once, and that's on the initial render. So if we reload and take a look at that, we'll see that this is only going to run once, and then we are done. That's an example of what useEffect can be used for. So in this case, useEffect acts like component did mount from class components. Yes, the second argument you can also pass. You can also say keep track of. So in this case, we are saying that every time count changes. So notice that when I remove count and I have this, it runs once and stops. But when I add count here, it's going to keep counting. And this is because this dependency array here tells useEffect when to run. So in this case, I'm telling useEffect, keep track of count. And whenever count changes, we run this function. That's basically what everything I've written here is doing. So I'm just saying that if count changes, we run whatever function I pass to you as an argument. Whenever count changes, we run whatever I pass to you as an argument. But if I have an empty dependency array, it's going to run just once on initial render. So it can be an array of items that you are keeping track of. And usually these items you're keeping track of are being used by the function that you passed as an argument to useEffect. So useEffect by default will clean up and reduce memory leaks on its own. But you as the programmer or the developer writing the code can also do some cleanup in the useEffect. And how you do that is you use the return statement. So every time you do, so let's change this. So we'll have something here like, no, let's use some other, let's create another use effects. So you can have multiple use effects. So it's perfectly fine to have this. And then you can have another one like this. So this is absolutely valid. So let's see, I have again, we are keeping track of counts, and we are saying that updates or increments count every 1 second. So in this case, we wanted to do a cleanup after set timeout has run, and to do a set timeout, we use the clear timeout in JavaScript, and we only want to do that at the end of the life cycle of our components. So that's why we are using the return here. So we are returning this function which clears out this timer. That's just it. So in this case, we are doing some cleanup ourselves, and useEffect allows us to do things like this. So to clear this timer, you have to name it, otherwise you won't be able to clear it. That's why I did this. So it's the same thing as this. I just gave it a name by doing the let timer equal to this, and then I cleared that, because clear timer needs to know what timer you are clearing. So if I hover clear timer, you see it takes a timeout ID, which is basically this. So that's it for useEffects. Are there any other questions on useEffects? So we'll talk about context, and the useContext hook we use to keep track of states, global states in a component. So you can use context together with useState to share state between nested components. So if you have a parent component, let's say we have a parent component. I'm just going to do this for demonstration. So let's say we have a parent component that has children components. Let's say we have multiple child components like this, and let's say this child component here has another child component like this. So if you had to pass a prop, let's say from the parent, let's say here let's assume that we are in the parent component, and we have a color variable that we need to use in another child component. Without context, how we will do this is we will have to do what we call prop drilling. So we'll have to pass color attribute to this component, which will then pass that color attribute to this component. Now this works, but it is very, very error prone, because what if another developer comes in and their task is to remove this child component? That means this another child component will crash because it's no longer getting the color variable. So this variable is now undefined. So this component here can no longer work as expected. And to prevent, so this is generally what we call prop drilling. So in this case, you are drilling a prop from a parent down to its child components, and that is bad practice. The most that can be acceptable is one level of prop drilling. That can be acceptable. But once you start going to 2, 3 levels, you know that you have to have some form of state management. And state management allows us to have a global state that all components can access. And that's where you can use something like the React context hook. So let me give us an example. So the context hook, you will need to create a context. So let's say car context. And we call create context. So in this case, we are creating a context, and we are saying, expected one argument. So this is our car context. To use and make use of the context that we are, so think of context as a general basing that all components can zip from. But to make use of this context, we have to wrap all the components that we are using. So generally, you will be creating your context where you have your initial app file. For simplicity's sake, I'm not going to go through all of that process. I just want you to understand that how use context works. So you would have to have what we call a context provider. So let's say you have a parent, and in your parent's component, you're going to have, let's say we're keeping track of color. So we're going to use that context that we created, and then we are going to use a provider, and then the value we are passing here is the color. So in here now, we are going to have all of our child components. Let's say we have a simple child component here that needs a color. Let's see for our function here, child, and then it takes color. So this is how we would use context. So in the initial case, we had to do prop drilling. So we had to pass this manually to our child component. But in our new case, remember we said context is like a basin that all components can zip from. So we have created this context here. We have created a provider, and we have given that provider a value of this color, which means every component that is within this that is a child of this provider can access this color variable. And how do you do that? You use the useContext hook. So you see that with prop drilling, I had to create an interface for child props, destructure the color like this. But now, because we now have our context, our child component does not need all of this. We can just use our useContext here and do something like use context, and then we'll pass the context that we want to use, in this case our car context. So now this child component has access to that color variable, and we no longer need to pass this from our parent component. So this is basically what context, the use context hook allows us to do. It allows us to be able to have a global store that other child components can dip into and get values from. Are there any questions on use context? We have some guy crying here. Are there any questions on use context? Can you second argument? Yeah, go ahead. Pass the something else.
Okay, so I wish to ask, what if I have so many variables that I need to pass into the context? And also, what about functions, passing functions also to the context? And lastly, what is the draw? Are there any flaws with using use context compared to other state management like Redux? That's it, sir.
This is the same thing. So here we'll have, let's say, car, and then we can say card or brand or whatever. So you would have to create a type in this case, because right now the context has an empty object. TypeScript will complain here, but this works. But basically, this is how you can have multiple variables in the use context. So you can pass the variables from, you can create an object in the use state like this, and then you pass it to the provider, and then in the child component, you use it like this. So but take note that when you're using this method, you have to have a type, you have to define a type. If not, if you're using TypeScript, it's going to complain. What was the other question?
The other question was functions. Maybe a set something you want to set, like set color.
You can pass anything. Functions are first class citizens, so they are you can treat them like, so anywhere you can pass a normal argument, you can pass a function.
The last one was, what are the difference between using use context and other state management like Redux? Do we have flaws?
Redux critically does the same thing. It's just a better state management. Trade context is a bit simplistic, especially when you're doing state management for very large applications. Context can quickly get out of hand because you have to create a lot of context, and you can start having secular dependencies and stuff like that. When you're using context, Redux solves all of that, or other state management tools that you want to use. So for simple components, you can use context like this. Generally, people use context for things like theming in your application. So being able to display light and dark mode, you can keep track of those styles using context. That's one of the places where you can use context.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
When you say reiterate again, I don't know what you want me to reiterate again. You want me to start from the beginning and reiterate again, or do you want me to? I don't understand. So I'm going to talk about useRef next. So the useRef hook allows you to persist values between renders. So remember in our counter here, we were updating the value between renders. But now, what if each time this component renders, I want a value to stay the same. I don't want the value to change. I don't want it to be reset to its initial value, and I don't want it to increment or decrement, whatever is happening. I want it to stay the same. useRef is the hook I'll use for that. So useRef is very simple. You just have a cons, and you can have a useRef like this. So in this case, we'll call it something else, or call it time accounts. So I'll also import. So remember we said everything comes from React. I'll also import useRef like that. 。 And in our new use effects, I'm going to say count.current. So I'll use timer count. So how you access the current value of a variable that is being kept the same by useRef is you access the current value. So we'll do timer count into the current plus 1. And if we want to render this, we will do a text, and we will do render. So in this case, we are saying we can see that our render count will show just once because ref does not, its value does not change. So useRef returns one item, which is an object, and that object is called current. So you use the useRef to set the initial value, and then you can use or access or change that current value as you see fit. But basically, this timer count value is going to stay the same across renders unless you manually change it. So this use effect here is actually rendering, but it's not changing our timer count because our timer count stays the same between renders. That's basically what useRef does. You can also use useRef to access DOM elements. So for example, I could create something like input elements, and I'll do the useRef. And then in a let's say I have a function that focuses a user's cursor on particular inputs, and I'll do input elements dot current dot focus. So it's going to complain here because useRef here doesn't know what I'm doing here. But using, I could say HTML input elements, for example. So in this case, the HTML input element has a focus. What is it complaining? It's possibly undefined. Yeah, these are now TypeScript issues. Ignore all of that, but basically that would get the error fixed. So I can also use useRef to keep track of an element and then force certain actions to happen. So in this case, I'm saying that I want to keep track of an input element, for example, and I'm saying that when a button is clicked, I want to drive focus to that input element. So here now I can have another button. If we duplicate this and do this, and our buttons we should have, okay, we already have a margin here. So in this case, we'll say focus. And when you click this, you want to have focus input. So in this case, if I created an input field here, this, whenever I click on this button, the cursor will move to this input element and focus on it. In that case, you can just start typing. The imports are at the top of the file. I said you import everything from React. So all the hooks we'll be talking about will be from, most of the hooks we'll be talking about will be, majority of them will be from React. So these are already defined hooks that are available to you when you're doing React Native. At the end of this, I'm going to talk about custom hooks, about you creating your own hooks. So these are already predefined hooks, so you can import them from React. In the case of using a useContext hook, you have to import both the create context and the useContext hook. Create context already comes with a provider object. So whenever you create your context, you can just have the provider like this. So another instance of another scenario where you can use context is when you have UIs that are very dynamic. So in some cases, you can have a UI which changes depending on certain variables for the user and stuff like that. You can keep track of all of that using context. It will be a bit tedious to set up Redux just to keep track of UI elements and stuff like that. So you can also use the useRef to keep track of previous state values. Also use useRef to keep track of previous values. So the next ones I'll just talk about them, but I'll not write any code on them. So the use reducer is similar to the use state hook. It allows for custom state logic. So you can actually implement your own sort of rudimentary Redux if you use the use reducer hook. If you understand how Redux works, that's exactly how the use reducer works. It takes an initial state. It needs a reducer function to work on that initial state, and then it has a dispatch method. So again, I'm not going to write code on that. If you know how Redux works, that's exactly how use reducer works. Use callback returns a memoized version of a function. So we're talking about use reducer. So basically, Redux use callback returns So if you know what callbacks are in JavaScript, use callback returns a memoized version of a function, of a callback function. useMemo is similar, but it returns. So useMemo and use callback, people usually confuse them, but just understand that use callback is for functions, useMemo is for variables. They both return memoized values. So a memoized value is, or a function is basically a value that has been cached. And so that value or function will not change if a specific variable or I'm trying not to write code for this too. So for use callback, let me just do something like add. Let's say we have adding a to-do list. You are use callback. And it sets its to-dos. And then in here it says to-dos. So basically what this is saying is use callback here is basically ensuring that this function in here does not run unless the to-dos change. So it's similar to useEffect in a way. And useMemo will do the same thing, but for a variable. So in this case, use callback is keeping track of this function, and it's only calling this function if this variable changes. In useMemo's case, it's keeping track of a variable, and let's see, in our case, you have an expensive that takes, let's say, counts. In this case. So let's say we have a function. Let's just create a function here. Expensive. Let's just say we have this. It's an So let's just say we have a very expensive calculation here that takes a lot of resources and time, and we don't want to run it every single time. So in this case, this one returns a value, and that value is what we are using in the rest of our application. Now, we don't want to run this calculation all the time. We only want to run it when this value changes. And we know that this value is not going to change often. So in this case, we can use useMemo. So useMemo is basically going to cache the value that this function returns and then give us. And every time that this count changes, it's going to rerun this. But if the count does not change, it's not going to rerun this. So this helps us optimize our applications a bit more. Same thing for useCallback. The only difference is useCallback works for functions while useMemo works for variables. So now I'm going to show you how to create your own hook. Okay. Before we create our own hook, we'll just talk about creating or doing or making API requests in React Native. Unless somebody has a question they want to ask us before we continue. So making requests in React Native, you can use the Fetch API or we can use Axios. So I'm going to show you both, and I'm going to quickly talk about Fetch and Axios. So Axios, to use Axios, you actually have to install it in your application. To use Fetch, Fetch is already available to you from JavaScript. So Axios. So Fetch is a built-in API. Axios is a third-party HTTP client library. There are other libraries that you can use for making requests or API calls in React Native, but we are going to focus on these two because these are the most common. So if you wanted to get, I'm sure we all know what API calls are or API requests are. If you wanted to get, let's say,
I don't think everybody knows. Maybe just give an idea what API calls and requests are.
Okay, in simple terms, let's do it like this. Let me see what it okay for you. So an API is an application programming interface. Trying to get a very simple and easy way to understand this.
You can use maybe digital renter API, for example.
Okay. So before we go to this, an API. Okay. Now, what does an API do? So imagine you go to a restaurant, right? And you want food. So let's say John goes to a restaurant and he wants to eat food, right? A waiter has to come to John and get his order. So John gives his order to the waiter. The waiter then takes that order to the kitchen, where based on the order that John passed, food is then returned to to John. So you now have kitchen, waiter, and John. So this is basically what an API does. So in this case, the waiter is our API, and John will be the client, and kitchen will be the server. So an API is an application programming interface, and it allows us to request, update, or create resources on a server using a client. In our case, the client can be a mobile app, so your React Native application, a web app, so if you create an app in React, or a desktop app. So this represents clients. Servers now will be backends that have been built to handle and receive this request. Like Martin just mentioned, the digital renter API. So making API calls is the act of using our client to make requests, because in our example that we gave, John is making a request from the kitchen. John's focus is resources that are found in the kitchen. So these are where we have our resources. In John's case, food. John needs food. So this is a resource that John needs from the kitchen. So John makes his request using an API. And the act of making that request is what we are referring to here as an API call. I hope that was very clear. I tried to make it as, let me see. So if we wanted to use fetch, for example, let's say we are using, let me see if this just okay, so this is a free fake backend that we can use. So it has various endpoints that you can call. So I'm going to just call. So I'm going to get a list of users from that endpoint. So in our case, our endpoint is the JSON placeholder type code API. So you can also use the digital renter API if you have access to it. You can also use a backend provided to you by your developer or the backend guy. So when you have that API, you have to make an API call. And using fetch, we can make. Let me see. I forgot. So API calls are of 4 formats. You have a get, post, put slash, and delete. So this is what we refer to as HTTP verbs. So you can use them to request for resources on the server. So the get, for example, using get, you're trying to get a resource from the server. So you're requesting for a resource that is found on the server. Using post, you're trying to create a resource on the server. So for example, get, an example of this is when you try to download a file, for example. In that case, you're requesting for a resource, which in this case is a file. When you try to download a movie, in that case, you're requesting for a resource, which in this case is a movie. For a post request, you're trying to create a resource on a server. So for example, if you went to the day you created your GitHub account, you filled a form and you submitted that form to GitHub. You created a resource, which in this case is your account on the GitHub servers. A put or a patch updates the information already found on the server. So take note that if you use the get to request for a resource that is not found, you will get a 404. If you use the put or patch to update a resource that is not already existing, in some cases, it will create that resource. In other cases, it will tell you that the resource you're trying to update is not found. And the delete, well, is self-explanatory. You delete stuff on that server. That's basically it. So for the case of fetch, we can do a get request using fetch. You see that I don't need to import anything. I just need to write my fetch, and it's just going to work. It takes a URL as argument. In this case, please. So remember, we said it is promise based, so we have to provide or handle that promise. So we have to provide a function for when this works out well. So you can just console.one switch shows. And you have to provide an error handler. So this is a simple get request for using fetch, for example. If we had to use Axios, after installing Axios, so after installing Axios, you will do import Axios from Axios. You do like this, and then in your call for Axios, you will do Axios.get, and then you pass in this URL. And then you have so this is how you do a get request using Axios versus fetch. Now, if you wanted to do a post request, you would have to pass a second argument to the fetch function, and that argument is a config object where you specify the method. So if you don't specify the method for fetch, it automatically assumes it's a post request. Sorry, it automatically assumes it's a get request. Sorry. And then here you can pass information, let's say user ID 1 Jack. So this is how you will make a post request with so this is how you will make a post request with fetch. With Axios, you can just do Axios.post, and then you pass in your URL and object. Axios.put, Axios.delete. But with fetch, you just change the methods. So in the case of a put or an update, you do a put or patch, and then you pass in whatever you're trying to pass, and then in a delete, you pass a delete, and you probably have to pass in the ID you're trying to delete. So this is making API calls using get and let me see. Implicit error type. So Are there any questions before I try and see if my API calls work?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Concerning when you were fetching data from the API, and consider that we have dot, then the response, which is equals to a response of JSON. Does it mean that it takes that that data and then it converts it to like an object or something like I don't know if like what does it like actually like what does that and those statements under the fetch line do?
Fetch generally fetch will return text responses. So here we are converting to JSON. So here we convert to JSON and then we use that JSON in our application. So in this case, we are fetching a bunch of users. So we can do and then here, once we get our users, we will do set users response JSON. Any other questions? So this is what this API returns. So this call that we made, we expect it to return an array of 10 users. So because we are expecting an array, we can create our users variable here and keep track of it using useState, and the initial value will be an empty array. Now, once we get our response from our API, we set now that value to this, and we can look through that in React Native using, let me see, users.map. So let's just do a text. So user.name. So do user.id. What's happening? So this is generally, so we see that we are receiving 10 users from our API. So what we have done is we made our call. So remember our example here, we said we wanted food from the kitchen. In this case, we want a list of users. So we said, this API, I want users, get me those users. And then we took the response, we converted it to JSON, and then we used that response in our application. Because we know that this returns an array, we created a variable to keep track of these users. So initially we had 0 users, so we had an empty array. And now that we have gotten our users, we update our array. So we are just replacing everything because it's an all or nothing update, and then we are using that in our application. So these are just TypeScript errors, right? These are just TypeScript errors. These are just TypeScript errors, basically. Now, if you see that we have our 10 users being displayed in our application, let's just create a small container so I can show you. Yeah. So we can also have other information like the username, the email. So we could also do, let's just add another just for the sake of it. So now we have 10 so the general example or the general usage that you would have for fetching APIs is you would generally have this in a use effect. So when the application loads, remember we said if you have a use effect, we said if you have a use effect with an empty array, it runs once. So what you would usually do is you would have a function that does the fetching, and then you will call that function in your use. Let's say we have a function here called fetch data. And in there, we want to get all of this. Copy this and put here. And then comment this out. So you see that nothing happens here. So if I get into this function here and I call fetch data, you see that I get my data. Now, what this does is it prevents us from overloading our server with too many requests. Because if, for example, I just had my fetch data outside, and then I had another variable that was constantly updating its state, I would be making multiple requests to that server. But now I only want to make one request, and that one request should get me my data that I need. That's why you would usually use a function, your API call in that function, and then you use effect with an empty dependency array to make an API call. Are we clear? I hope we are clear on that. Now I'll just show you how to create your own hook, your own custom hook. So all the hooks we've been seeing up until now were predefined hooks, so hooks that are already being defined by React Native. But now we want to be able to have our own hook. So usually, if you notice something peculiar with our hooks, all of them had the use before some other word. So generally, this is idiomatic. When you're writing code in React Native, you would use this format or this way of defining your hooks so that other developers know that this is not just a function, but it's a hook. So if I wanted to create, for example, a fetching hook, a hook that fetches data, for example, I'll call it useFetch. And my own hook will take a URL, which is a string, and I'll do something like data sets data useState. So you see that you usually use useState and useEffect in a lot of the components that you'll be working on in React. So in my case, I'll do useEffect. And I want to use my fetch API. I know that it takes a URL. My data, and I'm setting my data. And I only want this to run once or when the URL. So I want it to run either once or when the URL changes. So if you pass a variable like this to useEffect, it's going to run it once. And then if that argument or that dependency that you pass changes, it's going to rerun that useEffect function. So in this case, I want to return that data. So this is my own custom hook that I've created. So fetch data given a URL. So in this my hook, I've kept it simple and I've only said it's only making get request. Remember we said for fetch, if you don't specify a method, it sticks to get. So you can expand this to support all the verbs that we saw: the get, the put, the push, the put, patch, and delete, and so on and so forth. But in this case, I'm going to stick to just this get request. So how will I use my custom hook in my component? So if we come here, for example, we see all of this. What I will do is, rather than having all of this, I'll comment all of this out, and then I'll do something like const data. Remember, in my hook, I was returning data. So I know that that's what I expect here. And then I'll do use fetch, and then I'll pass in this URL, because in my custom hook here, I said I'm receiving a URL which is a string. So that's the same thing I'm doing here. So I'm just going to do this. And now, rather than doing users.map, I'll just change all of this. So if I post this, I'll just change this to data, and it should still work. Why is it not working? You can ask your questions. You can ask your questions while I figure out why this is not working. Possibly null. Any questions? So we have created our own custom hook here. So this is our custom hook that we created. And we said it has an initial value of data, which is null. You could put an array here if you wanted. And based on the URL the person provided, we are making a call using useEffect. And then we are returning that data that we got. So now in our code, we are using our hook here. So we have called it here use fetch, and then we are passing in the URL, and then that data we use to display that information in our mobile application. So that's it for creating custom components and making REST calls. So any questions on everything that we've seen so far? Any questions, any worries, any doubts? Can you still get me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So
Because there was silence. Is it that we have understood everything I've said, or we are still thinking of the questions? Let me see if I missed any question. How do you understand React Native style sheets? Are there any questions? Any doubts? Any worries? So everything that we've done, ignore all of the TypeScript stuff I was doing. There wasn't even much of it. It would still work for you. My own editor will complain because I said I was using TypeScript, but ignore all of that. All of this is just JavaScript. So this is exactly what you would have in your JavaScript file. So don't worry about any of the other things. So I think all of this would work fine. Yeah, sure, go ahead. I
Sir,
think so.
please, I wish to ask, how do we know the API that was supposed to come?
Generally, when you're working in a project, you'll be given the endpoint. So this is what we call an endpoint or the API documentation. So this, for example, what is that? So this, for example, is an API documentation. You learn more about this as you go forward, but you'll be provided that information. Or if you Google, you'll be able to find it. There are some free APIs that you can Google and find. Yeah. I hope that answered your question. So the information will be provided for you.
So do we have any more questions? Okay, I see something on the chat. Okay. Carlson, you want to say something?
I have nothing to say. I was hoping there would be questions.
Well, honestly, most of them are still relatively new to React and React Native. So one person just made mention on the group, on the chat. Some of these things are new. They have not made use of it. So hopefully during the project phase, which will start in January, they will be able to get their hands more dirty with the projects as time goes on.
Okay. In that case, if and when you get to this part of it and you want to try, feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. Wishing you good luck on your journey to learning React and React Native.
Okay. Thank you very much again, Carlson. Guys, let's show some love, sending some emojis on the screen. He's been really, really instrumental and helpful. Thank you again, Carlson, for making out this time. I know you should be with your family now, you should be resting, but you're sacrificing your time to pass on the knowledge and the skills which you've gathered over the years, and we really appreciate. And hopefully you'll be able to see the great work that the participants are going to do and present during demo day. So guys, please don't disappoint when it's time for you to use the useEffect, useState, useRef, useMemo, the API call that you're going to be doing in your projects. Ensure you are able to represent very well. So no, you not share his contact. I think you can get him on Carlson. How can they get to you? On LinkedIn, right? Or Twitter?
I'm not active on those.
Okay, how do they reach out to you if they need support?
You can just text me on WhatsApp.
Okay, so maybe if you want to drop your number on the chat box so that those who will be interested to reach out to you, please be respectful when you reach out to him and be very straightforward with what you want. Don't just go and ask that, can you please reiterate? No, make it your problem, what you're asking him should be very, very specific, clear. And you should also show that you have made an effort research before coming to him, else he will not respond to you. So thank you again, Carlson. I think we are done for today. Let's have an excellent evening. On Thursday or on Saturday, we will have the next session. I'll communicate it on the group, and that is going to be on Git and GitHub. I noticed a couple of people complained about their Git and GitHub disturbing. So that one is going to be taken by engineer YG Collins, and he's going to explain and show you people how to work with Git and GitHub so that your code can be maintained very well with the version control system. Without much ado, let's have an excellent evening and bye-bye.
I'll just
Okay.
send the file to Martin. Anybody who wants it, you can get to him to get the file.
Okay, cool. So he will send the file to me and I'll send it to the group so that every person can have access to that. Okay, bye-bye all. Good night.
Good night.